Hello and welcome to the Rope Access and Climbing Podcast. I'm your host, Mikey Stevenson, and today I'm going to be talking to Brendon about rope access compliance with standards and regulations and how they correspond with one another. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Step into your harness and get ready for a podcast about the vertical world. On this week's episode, Brendon and I dive into the conversation about standards, regulations, and procedures, and how they relate to one another. This is a great conversation for new level 3s that need to understand their liability. So, without further ado, let's dive in. All right, well, let's start out with introductions. So, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what's your name, and what's your position within the rope access industry?
Yeah, thanks, Mikey. My name is Brendon Slaney. Grew up in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. Been living in Calgary, Alberta now for the last 7 years. Did some international traveling in between after university. But basically, my position currently within the industry is I'm Rock Canada's rope access manager and errata technical authority. Before that, I was involved at field level, tech labor, sales, operations, project management. Pretty much have my hands in a lot of different aspects of the industry. So a lot of my experience comes from different points of views, which is it helps me in my dealings with all the different departments of a large organization currently.
Perfect. Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about rope access compliance with standards and regulations here in North America specifically. So I guess, can you describe the difference between rope access standards, government regulations, and company procedures?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic we could talk about for a long time, but I'll try to keep it concise here. Basically, the rope access standards I view as our overarching guidelines. They are our best practices that we follow as technicians, which are set out by our governing bodies, specifically in North America. We're talking about errata and SPRAT here. Going into that, the government regulations fall after, and then company procedures, which I think we're going to talk about, right?
Yeah, and just we're going to dive into how they kind of work together and try to make this as seamless as possible. In Canada, we have provinces that regulate rope access. So we have Alberta, we have BC, and Nova Scotia. And then there's a couple other provinces that are currently in the talks of trying to regulate rope access. Do you think this is a good thing for our industry?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. I think it reflects growth in our industry. I think it reflects maturity. It being around more and more facilities, you're starting to see the third-party governing legislative bodies have no choice but to address it. So I think it's nothing but positive in terms of the legislation. And I know Manitoba being the most recent province that's looking at adopting it. So it's only a matter of time until it's across all provinces and territories and then down through the U.S. as well.
Awesome. Now, I guess, what should technicians know or do if they are operating in these provinces that do not currently have a rope access regulation?
If they do not have a regulation, you really need to lean on your company procedures because they would have been tailored, in my experience, around the existing legislation, and they would have been adopted as best as possible using the overall standards and the current legislation in place. And then you could also look at site-specific requirements as well. So you really need to understand your company's point of view and make sure you're following that as best you can. You don't want to be too creative, I guess, in terms of your the way you access work sites. You could be hit with a stop work order, which I know Ontario has been an interesting case study, and there has been some instances where OH&S has come and performed stop work orders on rope access, and I think they're currently working through that unique situation right now. So, yeah, as a tech, just follow your company guidelines as best you can and apply them to your field work.
Sounds good. Do you think that adopting higher standard, if you are working in these other provinces, so say that you are working in a province that doesn't have a regulation where you were working, do you think that that's a good practice, or just stick to the company procedures that are drafted around these existing regulations?
I think it's a good practice to understand what an adjacent province might be doing. I'll use Saskatchewan, for example. It's not uncommon to look at Alberta's legislation within Saskatchewan as a guideline, but everyone needs to understand that you're not working in that jurisdiction that you might be reading. So I think it's just being aware of where your resources lie, whether it be from the provinces who adopt it, the overarching standards, your company procedures. At the end of the day, you need to make sure that you're following what's applicable for that area. So it's a slippery slope. I'm hesitating giving a direct answer there because everyone's going to have a different opinion. So
Yeah.
um, follow what we're taught as rope techs, and I think everybody would be okay at the end of the day.
Okay.
And then we'll let the legislation catch up as it has been.
Okay. Perfect. Um, I think that going back to the company procedures, it will cover you in the best case scenario in this circumstance, as it has been drafted. And you just need to make sure that you're asking your health and safety officer that's currently working with or for the company that you're employed by these sort of questions, and just make sure that you are covered.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask questions. There's lots of resources within companies that people aren't aware of. There's experts that you might not know unless you ask. So, yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Absolutely. How should tech treat local regulations compared to company procedures or rope access standards?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think first and foremost, you need to understand that they exist, which is obviously the starting point. I mean, when I first started in the industry, not that I wasn't aware of it, but I just my interest level wasn't there. And then as I got more mature within the industry, I started to understand everything behind the scenes. So there's so many resources now to pull from. There's really no excuse to not know they're there. The internet's at your fingertips at all times. But basically, you need to understand that your local regulations, your legislation, that's basically your legal requirement that you need to follow as set out by the jurisdiction you're working under. And then your company procedures and overarching rope access standards are the guidelines or your company rules that you're following as an employee or a certified technician under that standard. And fortunately for us, a lot of the legislation has been built around those overarching standards. So it's actually quite easy to follow it. You might not even know you're doing it, but you are.
Yeah, because when these regulations were developed, a lot of the rope access companies in the infancy of these regulations were brought into the conversation to make sure that the regulations met or exceeded, certain aspects of the standards and certain company policies and procedures. Now, keeping in mind that the regulations are kept to a minimum requirement, leaving it up to interpretation, just like standards are. But, like you said, as long as you're following your company policies and procedures and the rope access standard that you adhere to, chances are you're probably pretty safe that you are adhering to the local legislation.
Yeah, my experience has been the majority of companies' policies and procedures will supersede the legislative requirements. So as long as you're familiar with those, you're inadvertently following the rules behind the scenes.
Why can't us as rope access technicians just follow the rope access standard that we adhere to? So something that I've heard a lot in the industry, both as a rope access supervisor as well a rope access instructor is I'm IRATA safe. What does that mean? And why is that not good enough in our country?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue with the errata system being an international governing body. So my response to that is it's too broad of a document to really hone in on the specific geographical regions that errata member companies and technicians operate in. So you need to be aware that that document, nothing in that document says shall. It's should, where essentially that wording means it's a best practice. It's not an obligation. It's then up to the company procedures that we talked about before to then adopt that into the company's operating rope access fieldwork.
Right. So I guess to kind of make an overall conclusion here with the standards and regulations is as long as as long as technicians are, doing their due diligence and following the company procedures, they're generally going to be safe for the most part as long as they follow them. They're going to be adhering to whatever rope access standard that they're adhering to, if that's SPRAT or IRATA. And then the government regulations are also kind of built into that. Now, understanding where to get this information is extremely important to each and every technician that is working on ropes. It doesn't matter if you're a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3. Primarily, a level 3 is going to take the heat for not knowing the current company procedures, but this stuff is there to keep everybody safe, not just an individual. These regulations and procedures are also there to keep companies safe and free of liability. So as a technician, primarily speaking to level 3s here, you are legally obligated to follow these procedures. And if you feel the need to break these procedures, and I'm talking company procedures here, you are taking on the liability and the inherent risk of that action, just to be clear. And would you follow suit and say that that's pretty accurate?
I would agree. If you're operating outside of the letter of everything you just described, you are acting on your own accord. And in the worst case scenario, you're going to have to do a lot of explaining as to why you were doing that. And in my experience, it's not typically going to end very positive for the individual who acts outside of that lettering.
Yeah. So like I mentioned there about being IRATA safe, you also have to keep in mind that every rope access organization does adhere to the code of you must adhere to the highest standard, keeping in mind that the rope access standard that you adhere to is the minimum requirement, and local legislation and or company policies more than likely will always supersede that requirement.
Yeah, I mean, almost every legislative requirement is written from a lesson learned, which unfortunately meant a serious incident. So each region, again, would have different experiences and different lesson learns to adopt so that doesn't happen again in the future.
Absolutely. Moving on here, we're going to dive into the paperwork side of the conversation here. This also goes to say, like with our compliance with standards and regulations, there's always a paper trail for everything we do. So what kind of paperwork should technicians be aware of prior to starting work?
Yeah, there's a lot of paperwork. It starts at the onboarding process. If you're a new hire on a company and there's no onboarding documents, you might want to ask the question as to why that is. But specifically to projects, for pre-project paperwork, you're looking at company JHAs, job hazard assessments, safe work plans, method statements, whatever you want to call them. They're all essentially the same thing with different wording. You have your rigging and rescue plan, and then your emergency response plan, which a lot of times will be tied into your method statement and safe work plan. So those are your main pre-project documents that each technician should be aware of.
Okay. Is there will be differences between verbiage on the document. There'll be differences between or industries that you work in as well. So just keep in mind that you as a technician, if you're listening to this, make sure you ask the question about the paperwork that is required for you to start your job, let alone continue your job.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. Everybody needs to understand what's required in oil and gas versus infrastructure or building maintenance will be different. So ask questions, understand what you're reading and why you're signing it. Make sure that it's in place before you're working.
Yeah, and make sure that you understand that it is your legal obligation to read and understand, and then you signing is verifying that you understand and accept the hazards that you're going to work towards. So, next question, what should a new technician do if there is no paperwork? We kind of touched on that, but just to kind of elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, if you're a new technician and you're not seeing any paperwork, best thing you can do is start to ask questions. Where is the paperwork? I remember being told in my onboarding documents that I had to do X amount of pre-checks, documentation before the job. Just challenge your supervisor, although he might not like that, but that's part of his job. And it's part of your job as a technician to ask those questions.
Yeah, it's going to come down to keeping you and everybody else around you safe. Never be afraid of intervening on anybody, even if it is your supervisor.
Yeah.
How important is it to fill out the company paperwork on each job? Or is it kind of, is it going to be job to job, or is it a blanket paperwork? How does that normally work?
Yeah, a lot of that will depend on the circumstance, but the majority of the time, it is specific to the job or task at hand. Essentially, no work under my jurisdiction that I'm currently under occurs until the paperwork's completed. Everybody needs to understand that the audits that occur, if there's an incident or just a spot audit from site safety, the first thing they ask for is the paperwork. Can I please see your paperwork? After a friendly introduction is normally what occurs. And if you don't have that paperwork for that individual, you're going to be asked more questions, which may lead you down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down.
That is fair. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the paperwork is presented to the crew, filled out properly, and that everybody is aware of the job or the scope?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer is it's everyone's responsibility. But if you want to get specific, it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that they provide that to their team. When that happens, it's then the supervisor's responsibility to make sure that it's implemented across his team of 3, 4 individuals, whatever it may be. And then again, you have to go back. It's then the employer's responsibility to verify and then improve on what is being filled out by their team. So again, it's everybody's responsibility with specific tasks for each person, including the employer, on that topic.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much there. Now, just touch a little bit on the logbooks, because logbook's still part of a rope access piece of documentation.
Yeah.
We got to make sure that we're capturing where we're working, who we're working for, the date, the time, and make sure that we're also including our signatures, making sure that they're all signed off saying that that information is accurate. And we got to make sure that this is done at the end of each job. Now, keeping in mind that maintenance jobs, no more than 14-day intervals as per IRATA requirements. SPRAT is different. But when it comes to paperwork, it doesn't stop just at the paperwork that you're doing the job for. The paperwork continues on to the personal level where you have to make sure that your logbook is also filled out properly and, it's not falsified in any way.
Yeah, I mean, again, this comment specifically to Alberta, but if an OH&S officer was to come up to you and ask for your logbook and you don't have it on you, you could be issued a monetary fine. So keeping it to the, why does that affect me? I mean, a fine is it's a pretty effective way to correct actions that are not suitable. So just keep that in mind. Keep it on you. Keep it tight. Every supervisor is going to ask for it. They're going to ask you why it's not filled out properly. Why is there spots missing? So that's your resume for jobs. I know when we hire individuals, we actually ask for photographs of their logbook before they're hired. I can call references. I can look at your experience to make sure you're not fabricating any information over the phone. So yeah, just keep it as accurate as you can.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's all I have for today. Is there anything you would like to add to this?
Nothing to add. No, I think it's good that you're doing this. It shows, again, I think the maturity and growth of our industry as more people adopt this. You're going to see a lot more content created. So happy to be a part of it. It's exciting stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to be part of my podcast here. How can people find you? Are you on social media or are you just...
Yeah. No, I am on social media. I don't have a massive footprint currently, but I have LinkedIn for professional dealing. So you can look me up, Brendon Slaney. My personal consulting website, ssa-access.com, which I created a couple of years ago. And again, I'm currently working for a rope access employer in the Alberta industry. So maybe I'll be calling you if I see your resume come across the board here.
Who knows? We'll see what happens in the next little bit here.
Awesome. Thanks, Mikey.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for tuning into today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to hit the like button and share this with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, as it really does help, as I am releasing new content every Sunday.